On Saturday, 17 May 1997, Laurent Kabila's forces seized power from Mobutu Sese Seko, marking the collapse of Zaire, the 32-year-old state which had been created by Mobutu out of the chaos of the original Congo. Zaire had been sustained with the help at different periods of Mobutu's Western allies, namely Belgium, the United States, and France. Mobutu's departure as the leader of Zaire was one of the most significant events to shape post-colonial Africa, and various analysts say that Mobutu created his own downfall with a mixture of extreme greed and short-sightedness. Mobutu was unable to adjust to the changing reality of the post-Cold War era and regional politics. He had trouble accepting that the United States would shift its support from opponents of communism to advocates for democracy. Most importantly, Mobutu also miscalculated in thinking he could gain from supporting Hutu militiamen against Tutsi rulers in neighboring Rwanda. This move backfired and contributed to his eventual demise. Born Joseph Mobutu in Lisala, in the extreme northwest of the then Belgian Congo, on 14 October 1930, Mobutu went on to become a definitive figure in the Congo's post-colonial history. Like a number of first-generation African leaders, the army made Mobutu. After he enlisted in 1949, the army provided him with a means by which he could later dominate his fellow citizens. Mobutu also grew to know many of the leading Congolese politicians during the late 1950s, including Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the Congo. In fact, Mobutu joined Lumumba's Mouvement National Congolais Party, the MNC. Mobutu's meteoric rise to power came during the Congo crisis of 1960 to 1964. When the Congo became independent on June 30, 1960, the coalition government of President Joseph Kasavubu and Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba appointed Mobutu the Secretary of State for National Defense, and he was responsible for the army. The army took on an important role in the Congo as it was tasked with preventing the cessation of the mineral-rich provinces of Katanga and Kasai. Patrice Lumumba was assassinated in 1961, and his successors faced difficulties governing the Congo. In 1965, a constitutional crisis developed in which the Prime Minister Moise Tshombe and the President Joseph Kasavubu wrestled for power. In the midst of this deadlock, Mobutu launched a successful coup d'etat. After taking power, he quickly moved to ban political parties, having blamed politicians for the Congo's ills. Throughout all of this, Mobutu was a master manipulator, violent when necessary, yet also able to charm his enemies into eventually becoming his allies. Mobutu gradually established a dictatorial regime after eliminating many of his allies and enemies among the politicians and the military. The dictator acted as a king and sole owner of the Congo. In the early 1970s, he intensified his authenticity campaign in which the name of the Congo was changed to Zaire and the names of cities were changed to their supposedly original African names. At the same time, he shackled regional administrators and vested so much power on the presidency that he became the sole legislator. Above all, Mobutu's means of control was personal down to the finest detail. Everything went through him. Because he was fearful of military coups, he purged the army of competent officers, switched money from effective to inexperienced brigades, and constantly disrupted the military command structure. This is all while some of the troops were often left unpaid, resorting, like every other state employee, to theft. Mobutu's army was essentially made up mostly of individuals from one region, and it had no capacity to fight any rebels. This would later prove to be detrimental for the dictator. Early on, Mobutu did much to enrich himself and members of his inner circle. His regime was the epitome of kleptocratic rule and remains one of his lasting legacies to this very day. Greed sustained Mobutu. His bottomless funds allowed him to bribe the incorruptible, and it was his command over cash flow within the country rather than the military apparatus which kept him in power for so many years. The demand for base metals such as cobalt and copper, of which the Congo is well endowed, was spurred by the Vietnam War, and this boosted the Congolese economy between 1968 and 1974. The vast revenues from these resources should have enabled the government to move millions of Congolese out of poverty, but were instead used by Mobutu to bribe political allies in the country and abroad and to strengthen the hold of his party over the country. In November 1973, in a drive to create a national bourgeoisie, which in his own words would spur Zaire's development, Mobutu confiscated all small and medium-sized enterprises and handed them over to his cronies. This was indeed a turning point in the country's economic history. The beneficiaries of this policy by Mobutu had no experience nor any intention of running businesses and merely siphoned the businesses' available cash and let them rot. By 1974, most of the businesses had folded, and this started a downturn in the national economy from which the country never recovered. All of this was exacerbated by the rapid fall of commodity prices, which brought most of the Congo's revenue. As a result, hundreds of thousands of workers lost their jobs, and this raised the levels of unemployment in the country. The government lost revenue and thus the means to maintain infrastructure, which quickly deteriorated. The economic deterioration of Zaire was such that civil servants struggling to survive on the measly salaries turned to extortion, contributing further to a system of corruption that became deeply entrenched in Zaire. Mobutu's policy of nationalizing industries and handing out lucrative contracts to his allies proved catastrophic, so in 1976, Zaire accepted its first structural adjustment package. But as one industry after another crumbled and the regime defaulted on debts incurred by massive loans, Mobutu could perhaps sense an end in sight. The economic erosion in Zaire fueled the growth of a credible opposition in the early 1980s, which saw the beginning of a half-hearted transition into multi-party politics as a way by Mobutu to quell foreign and domestic pressure. But I'll touch on this a little bit later. Despite his disregard for democracy and proven human rights abuses, Mobutu enjoyed widespread support from the international community, particularly the United States, France, and Belgium. Mobutu served as a bulwark against communism in the region, supporting UNITA rebels who were fighting against the communist MPLA regime in Angola. In fact, Zaire acted as a conduit for United States military aid to the UNITA guerrillas, which allowed Mobutu to act as a broker between UNITA and the Angolan government. Additionally, Mobutu's government's efforts to take on political and security roles in a region that was regarded as chronically unstable served as a justification for United States policymakers to support him. These efforts by Mobutu's government included Zaire's military interventions in the Central African Republic in 1979, in Burundi in 1972, and in Chad between 1981 and 1983. It is also worth mentioning that the soldiers that helped Mobutu crush rebellions in 1977 and 1978 were Moroccan, French, and Belgian. The fact that Zaire produced more than 70% of the world's cobalt may have had a lot to do with this. Following the end of the Cold War, Zaire lost both its strategic importance and the crucial international assistance that went with it. The old dictator Mobutu had outlived his usefulness to his former masters as a bulwark against communism in the region. Meanwhile, on the political front, in Zaire, discontent was mounting not only among the masses but also among the elites who had benefited from the regime. In 1980, in an unprecedented move, a group of about 13 members of parliament, led by Etienne Tshisekedi, wrote a letter to Mobutu denouncing the regime's mismanagement and the capture of the state by a clique and demanding political reforms. The reaction of the regime's repressive machine was swift and brutal. The members of parliament were all arrested and tortured, but this did not deter them. In 1982, in a show of exceptional courage and defiance of the law establishing a one-party state in Zaire, the MPs created a party, the Union for Democracy and Social Progress. Their struggle, combined with pressure from the regime's allies, forced Mobutu to accept multi-party democracy in April of 1990. The incumbent Secretary General of the Economic Community of Central African States was appointed head of a restructured transitional government that was installed on 4 May of that year, 1990. Over the next year, Zaire's constitution was revised to permit the formation of trade unions and at least 2 additional political parties. However, the euphoria generated by the prospect of a new political social order quickly evaporated as a result of Mobutu's continuing repression of opposition political activity. In particular, Mobutu's announcement that a limited multi-party system would not come into effect for at least 2 years led to a bloody confrontation at the University of Lubumbashi on May 11, 1990. Here, it was reported that security forces killed more than 50 student demonstrators. Eventually, Mobutu was persuaded by opposition pressure to announce on December 31 both presidential and legislative elections. They were scheduled to be held in 1991, as was a referendum on another new constitution. At the end of September 1991, under pressure from the opposition, Mobutu not only appointed as Prime Minister Etienne Tshisekedi, but he also agreed to the formation of an opposition-dominated cabinet and diminished presidential powers. In addition, a transitional constitution was adopted and it reinstalled the separation of powers and strengthened human and civil rights. In 1992, a sovereign national conference was convened to decide which form the new multi-party system would take. But rather than furthering the SNC's work, Mobutu successfully sowed division among the delegates and managed to stay in power. As you can probably imagine, Mobutu and his entourage did not want to relinquish power and lose all the privileges that they enjoyed. And so they did their very best to disrupt the running of the new government and then used military force to remove it from power. In fact, President Mobutu Sese Seko went on to dismiss Prime Minister Etienne Tshisekedi and his government illegally. Mobutu still retained the loyalty of the security forces and he managed to remain in power by a complex strategy that involved seemingly to agree to reforms but never implementing them, repression of the opposition, instigation of mutinies in the armed forces, and the fueling of ethnic grievances, as well as the cooptation of prominent opposition leaders. Amid the ensuing economic and political crisis of 1991, Mobutu's army turned on the cities, taking by violence the goods left unstolen after the leader's years of taking by stealth. Following this looting by the soldiers, the civilians followed suit. Shops, offices and factories were trashed and millions of dollars were stolen. This exercise was repeated in some towns in 1993, and it is alleged that on both occasions, Mobutu had encouraged the rampage by the army. By 1993, such was the conflict between pro- and anti-Mobutu forces that there was a duplication of political institutions in Zaire. There were 2 governments, 2 parliaments, and 2 currencies. This political stalemate was finally overcome at the end of the year when the 2 legislators merged into the Transitional High Council of the Republic, the HCR. But unlike the previous national conference, pro-Mobutu forces dominated the HCR. Mobutu Sese Seko, the quintessential Machiavellian operator, cleverly played the opposition parties against each other to maintain his grip on power. 7 prime ministers came and went during what became a 7-year transition, and many of the opposition parties were actually pro-Mobutu fronts. In the confusion, he cast himself as the only unifying political force in Zaire. But with the fall of the Cold War, the United States lost tolerance for Mobutu's resistance to democracy, and along with other Western countries, they cut off aid. In June of 1994, Zaire was suspended from the IMF and its collapse deepened. When the politicians were arguing in Kinshasa, trouble was mounting on the eastern fringes of the country. In fact, from April 1994, because of the genocide in Rwanda and the war that ensued, close to 1 million Rwandese refugees crossed the border into the eastern Zairean provinces of North and South Kivu. At first, Mobutu sought to use the arrival of Rwandan Hutu and Tutsi refugees in his country to ingratiate himself once more to the international community, not only as a Cold War ally but also as a humanitarian. Yet his strategy collapsed in the face of Rwandan opposition to his hosting of these refugees on Zaire's eastern border. This refugee crisis was the ultimate cause of his fall. Some of the refugees that had crossed over into Zaire fomented local ethnic strife, joining with local Hutus to drive Tutsis out of eastern Zaire and also using the refugee camps as bases to attack Rwanda. Now, Mobutu had miscalculated and underestimated the drive for survival of Rwanda's new leaders. In October 1996, Rwanda and Uganda invaded eastern Zaire. They recruited Congolese proxies who acted as rebels and as a front for this invasion. The leaders in these two countries used Mobutu's longtime opponent, Laurent Kabila, to front a movement called the Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo. These forces would eventually dethrone Mobutu. A former Lumumbist and Marxist considered unpromising revolutionary material by Che Guevara, Laurent Kabila's 30 years in the political wilderness made him a little-known figure, but one who, unlike more prominent leaders of the Zairean opposition, was in no way compromised by association with Mobutu or acceptance of political reward from him. On 24 October 1996, Kabila's campaign began. At first, the French, one of Mobutu's major allies, wanted to step in to rescue him. However, the Americans blocked the idea, saying that foreign forces should stay out of Zaire. Initially, Zaireans reckoned that Laurent Kabila was heading an invasion of Tutsis from Rwanda, and so they looked to their leader, Mobutu, to drive him back. When Mobutu returned from France, where he was getting treatment, in December of 1996, he was cheered by the masses. At this point, it looked as if Mobutu would outwit his enemies and work on a strategy to fully retain power. In this regard, he changed the army command. But unfortunately, all of this was to no avail. His troops kept on losing against Kabila's forces. This time around, it was clear for all to see that the end was near. Town after town fell to Kabila's rebellion. On 19 April, the rebel forces captured Lubumbashi, and it was only a matter of time until Kinshasa, the capital, fell. Mobutu's demoralized and ill-equipped army hardly fought the invaders. Mobutu had lost control of the situation. Ailing and weak, he was confronted with the fact that he could not muster up his divided and unpaid army to mount a credible defense against Kabila. In the final stages of the split, Kabila's troops were joined by the Angolan army, which seized the opportunity to flush out Angolan rebels who were using Zaire as their base. The bulk of the forces loyal to him were concentrated in and around Kinshasa. These included some 3,000 soldiers of the Division Special Presidential, the DSP, as well as several thousand UNITA soldiers, along with former members of the Rwandan army and the Hutu militia. This was the setting for the intense diplomatic efforts that were undertaken by special American envoys along with South African President Nelson Mandela and his Vice President Thabo Mbeki in attempting to set up a meeting for Mobutu Sese Seko and Laurent Kabila to negotiate. Under pressure, Mobutu and Kabila met for the first time aboard the SAS Otanika on 4 May 1997 off the coast of Pointe-Noire in the Republic of the Congo. These negotiations were presided over by Nelson Mandela himself. However, nothing of consequence came out of this meeting. A second meeting that was set for 14 May had to be cancelled when Mobutu was left waiting in vain for Laurent Kabila's arrival. The only reason for the diplomatic efforts was to convince Mobutu to yield power little by little in order to avoid bloodshed, and so that Laurent Kabila's forces could enter Kinshasa without fighting. On May 13, the government declared a curfew from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. while the opposition parties announced a general strike for May 15 and May 16, calling upon the citizens to stay home to avoid a bloodbath. On Thursday, May 15, three top generals, General Likolia, General Mahele and General Nzimbi, respectively Prime Minister, Minister of Defense and head of Mobutu's DSP, met 3 times with Mobutu to inform him that they could not defend Kinshasa and to encourage him to relinquish power. On Friday, May 16, Mobutu Sese Seko abandoned power and took refuge in his palace at Badolite while still holding on to his title of head of state. On Saturday, May 17, Kabila's AFDL soldiers entered Kinshasa without fighting. They were warmly welcomed by a population happy to finally rid itself of the reign of terror which had left it weak and drained. On the morning of the same day, Laurent Kabila proclaimed himself President of the Republic and took complete authority over the transition. Following his departure from Kinshasa on May 16, Mobutu Sese Seko did not even have the time to catch his breath at his palace in Badolite. On Sunday, May 18, he was forced to flee in haste to Lomé, the capital of Togo, when AFDO forces threatened to take over the region's airport. from Lome in Togo, where his friend Nassimbe Eyadema found his presence to be an embarrassment, Mobutu later fled to Rabat, Morocco, where he died of prostate cancer on 7 September 1997. Don't forget to like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.